Welcome to Free Media, I'm Robby Soave.
And I'm Amber Duke.
Well, Stephen Miller just dismissed a judge's authority to block deportations, defending President Trump's use of the Alien Enemies Act to expel alleged Tren De Aragua gang members, a group which has been designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Let's watch.
So you called the judge's order just earlier today, quote, patently unlawful, end quote, and said that it was an assault on democracy itself. Does that mean that the administration is ignoring this order, and might you ignore future court orders that meet the criteria you laid out?
The President of the United States and his administration reserve all rights under the Constitution to conduct national security operations in defense of the United States. The Alien Enemies Act, which was passed into law by the founding generation of this country, men like John Adams, was written explicitly to give the President the authority to repel an alien invasion of the United States. That is not something that a district court judge has any authority whatsoever to interfere with, to enjoin, to restrict, or to restrain any way. You can read the law yourself. There's not one clause in that law that makes it subject to judicial review, let alone district court review.
Trump took to Truth Social to call for the judge's impeachment, writing, "This judge, like many of the crooked judges I am forced to appear before, should be impeached."
And this all comes after Trump signed an order this weekend invoking wartime powers to swiftly deport anyone suspected of membership in the Venezuelan gang Tren De Aragua. The process does not allow for a hearing, which ignited fears it would lead to widespread deportations of Venezuelans who do not have connections to the gang. In a statement by ICE detailing how it's identifying alleged gang members, writer Josh Friedman notes the declaration ends with the weakest evidence: people deported without due process for being in a car and a home with other people who ICE thinks are gang members. And I think that is the concern here is, obviously there is no right for illegal immigrants who are part of some violent criminal gang to remain in the country. And I believe there's a strong mandate that the Trump administration has to address that problem. However, I don't think they should just grab people off the streets who happen to have tattoos they said are what makes you members of this gang. That actually sounds to me like all the crazy misinformation researcher people who are like, oh, that's a Nazi symbol on your arm or whatever that is. So, and there has to be due process, and they also can't just ignore court orders because they don't like them. It's fine if Trump wants to criticize the judge. I don't have any problem with that. Say whatever, but they have to appeal decisions they don't like, do they not?
I was reading the court filing from ICE in response to the judge's order about what they're using to identify the gang members, and I think it's a misconception that they're just looking at tattoos.
I'm sure that's not all they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, the field office agent who is conducting most of the operations here said that they are using traditional intelligence means of gathering information on these people, such as computer communications, online postings. They were looking at bank records. So it's far deeper than just, you look like you're in Tren De Aragua, we're going to subject you to expedited removal. And the typical process for countering a deportation, the due process that goes along with it, is different than it would be for an American citizen. So you don't get to go to court to appeal. You actually would do it in an immigration court, and that would be done after the removal is processed. So while they're in El Salvador with President
While they're in
Bukele,
prison? While they're in a massive detention facility.
That's how it works. If you get misidentified as someone who committed a crime in the U.S., if you're being held in detention, then you would have the opportunity to present your case in front of a judge. Really, it's the same thing here. You're just not subject to stay on United States grounds while that process happens. And that's the same with really any deportation. And then on the judge question, the problem here is that this is a foreign policy related operation, which is strictly under the purview of the executive branch. And I think the idea that there's judicial supremacy gets away from the idea of co-equal branches of government. And one of the things that Stephen Miller said in that CNN interview that I thought was very prescient was, would a judge have the ability to stop troop movements? Or, for example, would they be able to order that the president stop bombing Cambodia, which has been a historical action that a judge took. And the answer would be no, they don't, because they don't have any lawful jurisdiction over foreign policy matters. And because he's doing this under the Alien Enemies Act, that becomes a foreign policy national security matter. So I don't think the judge has discretion on that. But even if you accept that the Trump administration has to comply with that order, all the members of the administration who have been a part of this, including Border Czar Tom Homan, said that at the time the judge's order came down, the plane was already over international waters. You can't turn the plane around at that point. It's no longer subject to judicial review.
They can turn the plane around, and if they're going to...
Well, you can, but you don't... But
they're saying they don't have to.
Right, because once it's over international waters, it's no longer subject to that judge's order.
My understanding of this law, however, is though it applies to, it was initially because we were at war with France, right, under the John Adams presidency. We haven't declared war on these countries we're sending the immigrants back. Now, we may have labeled Tren De Aragua a terrorist gang. That's one thing. The other thing is the last time this was applied to jail people during World War II is like seen as a very dark chapter in our nation's history, the internments of Japanese individuals. I don't think I'm being a big bleeding heart lib to be concerned about not the deportation of demonstrably, provably criminal, violent gangs, but just anyone. I'm sure mistakes will be made with subject to due process on the back end after they've already been flown to a prison half a world away. That makes me uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable with the law being used for that end. And you might, for all I know, you're correct that they don't have to turn around when they're midair. But even if they don't like the judge's decision, they should go through the process of appealing it, even to the highest level where conservatives control the Supreme Court. I mean, they control so much of our government, and yet they're still going to... I often feel like they go about doing things in a way they know will fail so that they can complain about still being obstructed by the deep state somehow, right? They're gonna do it this way in a way that is obviously designed to provoke some lower level judge to say they can't. So they say, well, we tried, but the deep state thwarted us. We can't achieve anything we want.
I'll start with the point about the law being in reference to wartime. It also mentions invasions, which I think a lot of reasonable people would classify what's happened at the southern border under Joe Biden as an invasion, and that's what Trump declared as his authority for using the Alien Enemies Act, not that we're at war with Venezuela. And then on the question of the due process and being flown to El Salvador before you get the right to appeal, I would compare this probably to the Remain in Mexico policy, right? People claim asylum, and how it worked before Trump came into office was that they would get to wait in the United States for their court hearing. He changed that so they have to wait in Mexico. I think that's probably the most comparable situation where you're still afforded the right to due process, but that doesn't mean you get to stay in the U.S. while you wait for that to happen. Because regardless of whether these people are provably members of Tren De Aragua, which, again, it sounds like the evidence that's being used is much stronger than is being suggested in mainstream media reports about the operation, you are here illegally. That's easily provable, right? And so you're not afforded the same rights to stay in the U.S. while you go through the court proceedings as an American citizen would be. And then what was your last point?
No, I don't remember.
Okay, me neither.
But I don't necessarily trust or believe everything the mainstream media says about how they characterize these people. I'm sure I'm not claiming that they're just necessarily grabbing people off the street, but before they are put in this foreign prison, I want to make sure they're not grabbing American citizens. I want to make sure they're not, doing any of those things.
That's the case
and
of
I
any
don't
deportation operation. Though.
Well, I know, but I also don't, just as I don't have a lot of faith in the mainstream media, I also don't necessarily have a lot of faith in the procedures of government employees, be it in any office of the government, law enforcement, the post office, the DMV, whatever it is, I worry. And there can be time to double check and triple check if you have a process that's still under U.S. shores. After they're gone and out of the country, I have to imagine it's very, very difficult to plead your case that you were wrongfully deported while you're languishing in a foreign jail. That's my concern.
Maybe. I mean, the immigration courts work the same way whether you're here or not. But your other point was about just going through the appeals process and taking it to the Supreme Court. And while typically I would agree with you under ordinary circumstances, it doesn't feel like we're in ordinary circumstances. There are dozens upon dozens of cases, federal injunctions by singular judges, right? And the Supreme Court typically only has the bandwidth to take about 80 cases per term. So you're basically asking them to take up half of their typical caseload dealing with what are in a lot of cases, unlawful injunctions against the Trump administration, and that's just not realistic. And you're talking about stopping basically all of federal policy under the executive branch for a period of 6 months until we get to June and the Supreme Court starts handing down decisions. I would ask the Supreme Court to intervene now. Justice John Roberts has indicated that he doesn't want to do that, and he's come out against Trump for calling for impeachment of this judge. But if the Supreme Court is not going to keep federal judges in check and make sure that they're operating within the parameters of the judicial branch, then again, co-equal branches of government, the legislative branch is well within its right to impeach judges that are not following the law.
Yeah. Well, tell us what you think about this. Thanks for watching. There'll be more Free Media tomorrow. Tune in then, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Reason Free Media.